This is Computing Up, conversations about computation writ large, with Michael Littman and Dave Ackley. This episode was recorded January 11th, 2021.
Hey Dave, happy 2021.
Oh yeah, you too.
It's our first podcast since the new year has happened. Hopefully this year will be, not last year, so we'll at least see some different and exciting new things, if not a complete resolution of all the bad things that have happened in the past.
Yeah, some notion of progress would be nice.
So I thought it would be really fun to have a conversation today. So Dave, when you and I first started to work together, the first big project that we did was in the context of artificial life. So you had gone from doing some machine learning work to thinking about the connections between computation and biological life. And we did a fun paper together, and we got to go to the Artificial Life Conference, and we met all these cool biologists who were kind of like dabbling into computational concepts. And so we kind of went from AI to life. And so I thought it would be fun to talk to Heather Lynch today. She's the Associate Professor of Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University. And she works in ecology and evolution and thinks about actual real life, but has gotten very involved in topics related to artificial intelligence. So she kind of, we crossed her going the other way. And in particular, she, along with me, were both 2020-2021 Leshner Leadership Institute Public Engagement Fellows in the topic of artificial intelligence for the AAAS. And that's how I got to hear a little bit about her work, and I thought Dave, you'd enjoy kind of having a conversation with her too. So
sounds good to me.
Heather, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's really great to have you here. So I noticed on your Wikipedia page that in addition to this Leshner Leadership Institute Fellow position, you also are 2019 laureate of the Botvinnik Awards for Young Scientists. And this is a really prestigious thing. When I was a department chair at Rutgers, we worked really hard to try to get some of our young scientists this award, because it seemed like it opened a lot of doors, and it had a lot of positive buzz about it. And it was a little hard to convince some people that computer science was relevant to it. But it looks like they actually kind of picked you. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What was that process like?
Sure. No, that was a huge honor and quite a surprise. And in fact, I was the first ecologist ever to win the Life Sciences Prize, and the first person from Stony Brook. So I think
nice.
I was, it was a real shock when it came through. And I think in the end, what I was recognized for was the work that I've done to use computer vision and satellite imagery and remote sensing and statistical modeling to track Antarctic wildlife, which is my area of specialty, and to both map where the animals are now and where we expect that they might go in the future. And I think that combination of computer science and math and biology was something that they were very excited about, and it's something that I remain very excited about.
Okay, that's super interesting. So all right, so tell us maybe a little bit about penguins, because first of all, they seem awesome. They're so dapper and just interesting. You can make whole motion pictures about them, and people just eat it up. So what's the deal with penguins, and why is tracking them helpful?
Sure. Well, it's funny. I got into penguins via a very indirect route. So my training was in experimental physics, and I went to graduate school for physics, and I was studying, low temperature electron dynamics. And I made this big switch. It's kind of a long story, but I made this big switch to ecology, and sort of scratching my head and realized that I was not going to, or I didn't want to be the 50-year-old PhD student, and I was going to have to pick up where I could, working with some very large data sets that kind of leveraged my mathematical background. And so math felt like the side door into biology for me. And I kind of joke that penguins are something that even a physicist can identify. And so it was a natural study system when I became a postdoc.
Plus it's low temperature, right?
They're low temperature. So I went from low temperature electrons to low temperature birds. And I had never really done any real field work before I became a postdoc and started working on penguins, but this was great. They don't fly, they don't move very quickly. There's only about 17 species, so even I could identify them. And so it was a really nice way in for me into the world of field biology. And now I have a very large field biology research program, but I sort of, that came about relatively late in my career. And so it's been nice to both keep the mathematical aspects of what I was actually trained to do, and then all of this sort of field biology work that I've taken on quite a bit later. But to your question as to why penguins, we think of penguins like the canaries in the coal mine of Antarctica. We know that climate change is having a huge impact on the planet, but nowhere more so than at the poles, so both in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. And penguins are that thing that, are relatively easy to study. All the action in Antarctica is below the ocean. We can't see what's going on. And penguins are this one tiny part of the whole food web that pop up and they nest on the rocks, and we can count them and we know where to find them every year. And they're very convenient in that way. And so by tracking their populations over time,
contrast.
Exactly, we can. In fact,
they poop all over the place.
They poop all over
true?
the place, exactly. So we can actually see them from satellites, which is how I came to the work that I do now. Not just going into the field to study them in the field, but actually tracking them from space, which is I still find amazing that we can see them from satellites and we can estimate their abundance, and we know when their populations have moved or migrated or shifted. And that's a big part of what we do now, is trying to track them in that way. So in many ways, penguins for many people are not the interest specifically, but they are the thing that we can measure to understand what the ocean is doing. And that really is of concern.
So searching where the light's good means penguins there to some degree. Well, that's all fascinating. And there's so many things that I would follow up on that. I mean, was the process, was there any easy thing to say about leaving physics or moving on? I mean, I know you say it's a long story, but I mean, I know an awful lot of physicists who have moved on to something, sort of being, and just whether your story was anything easily summarizable or is just whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not an easy move. I mean, you probably know enough physicists to know that it feels like leaving the priesthood or whatever. It feels like you've fallen from heaven.
That's right.
Yeah, I think of physicists as being the most downwardly mobile of scientists, right? Because they really do a fantastic job of colonizing other fields in a way that it's hard to imagine an economist suddenly picking up natural language processing or something like that. But physicists, they get this wonderful training in problem solving that it filters out for really bright, sharp people. And if they get tired of physics, man, like everybody else wants them around because they're just really, powerful problem solvers.
No, I couldn't. I mean, in a way, I'm not sure I would have done anything differently. I think that physics makes for a good foundation for just about any field, and I genuinely believe that. But emotionally, it's hard to leave that field. It feels like you're leaving your family behind. So I think that was a tough transition. But like you said, when I did end up making that transition into ecology, I found that there were, in fact, many very bright people that had made the same move decades before, that had done amazing things in other areas, and that all the math that I learned, which actually I wasn't, as an experimental physicist day to day, I wasn't actually using. I actually could use day to day as a quantitative, more theoretical ecologist. It was funny when I transferred as a graduate student, which is extremely rare, and very naively I went into the department office. This was at Harvard University where I was doing my PhD. And I said, I'd like, where is the form to transfer into your department? I mean, it makes me laugh now because it was a ridiculous question.
That's not a thing we do.
No, They said that no one has ever done that in the history of this department. It's never been done. So I'm a strong believer that, people say no, just kind of out of baseline laziness. You know what I mean? It's not that they really feel strongly about it. So I went and I found an advisor and I figured out what my required courses would be, like how would I catch up. And I filled out the form for the department. It turns out there was a form.
Just no one had ever used it.
No one had ever used it.
They had a lot of copies available.
No, exactly. And I handed it to the department administrator essentially. And it was just like, I made it really clear that if she would just sign the form that I would go away. Like that was going to be the lowest energy solution, was just to sign the form because I had a plan. And I had a fellowship from Bell Labs, which made it possible.
Nice.
And so they did. They signed it, and I had to essentially take all the undergraduate biology courses that I'd never had. I took 0 biology as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, like going on field trips, with kids that were almost a decade younger, and start from scratch. And I had to teach as part of my degree. I had to TA a course. And at that point in the semester, my timing was about as poor as it could have been. I think it was Friday, and the semester started Monday. And they said, well, we've only got 2 classes for you that need a teaching assistant. One is Introduction to Organismic Biology Lab. And I said, well, no, I can't do that. I don't know any biology. I cannot teach that lab. And she said, well, the only other course we have is intermediate vertebrate surgery over at the hospital. And I said, I think that they expect those animals to wake up again, and I am not going to TA that class. So I ended up in Introduction to Organismic Biology.
Wow. Whatever damage you could do to the minds of the undergraduate does not compare to what you could do to a vertebrate.
Surgery.
Yeah, no, I was only ever 3 days ahead. 1 week would be studying the heart, and I'd be like, the heart, it has chambers. I don't know what they do. It was very much trial by fire, but
Wow.
I ended up finishing just 3.5 years later with a PhD. But that was kind of all in.
Oh,
and
dear.
since I've actually served as a Sherpa or a guide to many other people leaving physics who've seen that I've done it and wanted advice on how to do it or when to do it. And so it's been interesting. I didn't feel like much of a trailblazer, but there is a trail there, like you said, and other people are interested.
So Dave and I met at Bellcore, which is not AT&T, or sorry, not Bell Labs, but had just spun out of Bell Labs. And we had, I think, 2 physicists in our group over the time that I was there, right? I'm thinking of John Schottland. He was a physicist, but not in our group.
Well, physicist MD.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's
fair.
He would have done okay in intermediate vertebrate surgery.
He probably would have been fine at that. But he did a lot of really fancy mathy neural net stuff.
Right.
And then somebody joined later. Maybe you don't remember. I don't really remember. But somebody basically, they were closing down the physics part of the lab, and he's like, okay, then I'll do machine learning. and we're like, oh, actually, you probably could do that.
Right.
Well, that is a super cool story.
Okay. Well, that satisfies my itch. I mean, I was Googling around trying to learn a little bit about your stuff, and so I guess the dissertation was this stuff that turned into the spruce budworm versus the fires in British Columbia. I found this paper, Spatiotemporal, that had Ripley in it, which made me think of aliens, and so forth. So, but we don't have to go into it too far. But it's just. So I think Heather's, let's see if I can get it right. Heather's dissertation was studying a big data set, like you were just saying, about trees and forest fires and insect infestations, that there had been theories that insect damage could make things more likely to have forest fires, or that forest fires could then open the door to insect infestations. And y'all came up with kind of a slightly new or variant statistical measure of spatiotemporal correlation or something like that, which is fundamentally of interest to me because I'm all about spatial computation and engineering spatial computation, which you then have to turn around and understand because it's way too complicated to just say it always does what I want it to do, because it doesn't. And so this statistic, this Ripley's K function, which you modified, is one way of studying spatial scales. I don't know. Was the sticking the temporal part on the new thing that you were adding?
A little bit, yeah. So it's interesting. When I was looking, as I said, for a project that I wouldn't have to start from scratch, I picked up some very long time series of insect outbreak maps that had been drawn by the National Park Service, and got interested in this question of, do insect outbreaks predispose forests to fire and vice versa? And so we were looking for a way of evaluating contagion. But what's interesting about that is often when we're looking at the relationship between things in space and time, it's symmetric. And in the case of a insect outbreak causing a fire, that is directional in time. So that was one of the things that we had to work out, was that directionality. And I've since used that spatiotemporal Ripley's K function to work on a range of projects, some in a consulting capacity, for example, looking at the relationship between a stop and frisk and crime rates, or in a public justice sociology kind of context, or looking at the kind of work that I do now in terms of the contagion of behavior. So that element of trying to link space and time is actually something that has persisted as a thread throughout my research. But I like to say that I work on problems where the data sets are something only a mother can love. Like, if everybody else has looked at that data set and said the time series are too short, it's too messy, there's too much noise, it's too patchy, that's when I sort of fall in love with these, mutts of data sets. And so
give me your tired, your poor.
Give me something. Give me your lemon. Sets. I will make lemonade. And so that is what started my own current research in penguins, and was this historical data set that I used for my PhD. So I became the person who could rescue inference from these historic or ad hoc data sets that everyone else had pretty much given up on.
Cool.
Does that leave you thinking about causality as a specific thing to try to reason about? Because when you mention the insects and the forest fires, it seems like you could establish some kind of correlation, perhaps, but to be able to say, the insects make way for the forest fire or vice versa, you have to reason a little more acutely. And this is, I feel like within AI, this is becoming an issue that is important and not that well understood yet.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I sort of tackled that problem for my PhD in a couple of different ways. Was one of them was just using statistics, like you said. We're just really looking at correlations where it looked like insect outbreaks were associated with future fire, and also in the spatial vicinity. But another part of my research, which was actually never published, was actually building these very complicated partial differential equations models for the spread of insects, for example. So a much more mechanistic spread where we can start building this into actual models of insect spread. And these mountain pine beetles communicate through chemotaxis. They actually attract one another. And so the mathematics of understanding their diffusion is very interesting. But you're right, the statistical correlations is sort of part one. And then it's how do we build these into a mechanistic model, even just through simulation, to see whether our models reflect reality. And that gives us a little bit more confidence about the causality. But only experimental methods would probably nail the coffin on that one.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So another connection that I was thinking about a little bit was since you're looking at satellite imagery in a lot of these projects, you're looking down at the world and making it flat. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of the kinds of simulations that Dave runs have that kind of, it's actually satellite imagery. Just we usually don't think about it that way. We think about simulating the surface of a planet essentially, but really it's the view you'd get if you were in a satellite.
Absolutely. So, in fact, what's interesting is that it's not flat exactly. In fact, one of the things that we'd published a couple of years ago was working out the statistics of point patterns on a three-dimensional manifold that's projected onto a two-dimensional plane. And so most spatial statistics is done on that two-dimensional plane because you're just looking at X and Y. But it turns out if you're trying to look for the clustering of points and you've taken that manifold and projected it, it's gonna look like you have clusters of points on the steepest slopes.
Sides of mountains, yeah.
Exactly. Right. And so if you're trying to figure out, well, what kind of space or habitat do my animals like, it's going to look like they like slopes, but they don't like slopes. It's just the projection. So we have to think about how to do statistics on a manifold, which is something that kind of intrigues me. But the relationship between animals and their environment in three-dimensional spaces is one of the things that we're very interested in. And we have very good maps of the terrain now from satellites. So we can drape that satellite imagery on the complex topography and actually see how they're interacting with their environment.
And the idea is you're going to sort of unwarp for the height, but still end up with a flat mapping. So you don't actually have to do 3D analysis, but you you correct for the stretchiness of the slopes and stuff like that.
So what we do in that case, when we were just looking at locations as points on that manifold. Essentially, what you want to do is compare your patterns to random. And so in this case, what you have to do is simulate random on the manifold and then project in a way, or the other way,
3D surface.
On the 3D surface. So that becomes the null hypothesis. So if they're going to be clustered, they have to be clustered even against that. Beyond that. But one of the things that we're very focused on in my research now is understanding the very precise details of how penguins are nesting on this terrain. And what's interesting about penguins is that they're not only responding to terrain, they want to be on the tops of mountains because the tops of mountains are nice and dry, but they shape the terrain. They actually create the terrain because their nests, the combination of rocks and guano and all that, stabilizes the terrain and actually redirects the water flow around their nests. And so they create the terrain at the same time that they're occupying it. And so these feedbacks between them and their environment play into the patterns that we see now thousands of years later. So there's thousands of years of evolution in terms of their habitat that we're looking at.
Or sort of co-evolution almost, right? Between
Absolutely.
the environment and the critters. So, and I feel like you were already kind of onto this with the beetles, because the beetles and the forest is also this kind of the terrain influencing the critter and vice versa, right?
Absolutely, because those insects are in their case, they are actually flying through their environment, and they are looking for trees that are exactly of a certain age range. And so the fires are controlling the spatial landscape that they're flying through, but then the beetles then do have an impact on the fire regime, and they change the age structure. So that those complex interactions, I think, are really interesting.
I would think the shaping the land with guano. Well, I don't know, actually. I mean, I just don't know much about penguin poop, but I would sort of imagine that would be at a significantly larger time scale, so that the dynamics would kind of layer out, and you could get away with saying the landscape is flat, is constant.
You'd think so. You would think so. So what happens is that penguins want to be circular because they want to minimize the number of penguins that are at the edge, because that's where the predators.
So to be clear, groups of penguins want to be circular.
Groups of penguins.
Okay, all right.
Groups of penguins. So
it was sounding like physics for a minute there.
Imagine a circular colony. Exactly.
Or a spherical penguin.
The penguins themselves start out pretty circular. They don't need any help. But the colonies of penguins, they would want them to be circular. But yet the colonies are not circular. They're stripes, or they take these labyrinthine patterns, or they're spotted. They take all sorts of shapes, but they're not circular. And it turns out that because of all sorts of dynamics of them wanting to keep a closed neighborhood, they want to keep their neighborhood, but they're site faithful, that random fluctuations in their population drive this spontaneous symmetry breaking, that they will spontaneously break up into little groups, little subcolonies. They will not be able to maintain that circular shape that they want. So that would happen even if the landscape were flat. Now, when you add terrain, it turns out that the terrain is what breaks the symmetry. So they will preferentially occupy the highest parts of the ridge. So even though they would have spontaneously broken up into subcolonies, those subcolonies now take the shape of the terrain on which they're lying.
Right.
So
interesting.
One of the analogies that I would use, if you're familiar with an Ising model for ferromagnets, so you have spin up and spin down.
And we're back to John Shotland.
Exactly.
Right, that's where I first heard that phrase in 1989.
The penguins are like an Ising system. They all want to be next to one another. They want to be occupying every nest site. And we can think of the empty sites as being spin down. And that's where you start to get a loss of fitness for the colony, because that's where the predators can sneak in. Right. So what you have is an Ising model system in an inhomogeneous electromagnetic background. So the terrain is essentially this field in which this Ising model is relaxing. And the site faithfulness of these penguins creates this inertia that freezes them in a less than optimal state. So they cannot, in some sense, kinetically relax to the lowest energy state. We think of them as being in frozen states, where they're frozen in these higher energy states because of their site fidelity the timescale for relaxation is too long. So there are these very tight connections between the sort of statistical mechanics of an Ising model system and the shapes that penguin colonies take when you look at them from space, which we wouldn't have known if we weren't looking at them from space, that they form all the patterns that you would expect from any sort of Turing instability. So the statistical mechanics of penguins is something that there are very few people as excited about it as I am. But I think there's some rich theory in here that we're trying to work out. And now with drone imagery, because we can fly these penguin colonies with drones, we can create centimeter, in fact, sub-centimeter resolution, 3-dimensional maps of these colonies. Wow. So we can map out not only the terrain at the centimeter resolution scale, but where every single penguin is nesting in that 3-dimensional terrain. And so we can build individual-based models to model how colonies evolve over thousands of years, to show exactly under what conditions we will get stripes, and when do we get spots, and when do we get labyrinthine patterns. And it turns out that the patterns that the colonies take tell us something about the health of the colony. Like a healthy colony looks different from space than a colony that is declining, even if you'd never seen it before. So we can take a snapshot and figure out what happened 10 years ago, which I think is kind of crazy.
Once you know what to look for. Huh.
Once you know what to look for. And until we were able to kind of put the statistical mechanics framework with the 3-dimensional imagery provided by the drones, there were kind of two pieces of that had to come together. But now we do understand the shapes that these colonies take. And in fact, right now I have an applied math student working on the mathematics of shapes, the computational geometry of shapes, so we can quantify some of these changes that we see over time. So it down the rabbit hole we go, but
that's cool. No,
yeah, it's fascinating that it's just at the right level, right? It's
yes.
You could imagine the colony being so complicated that current mathematics really has nothing to say about it, and you can imagine it being so simple that you can fit a line to it, and then there's nothing interesting to say. But it's like just living at that sort of complex boundary where an Ising model, or some kind of a process model actually tells you something useful about the dynamics.
And you could think that it's purely like academic. But it turns out that these populations can fall off the cliff with these tipping points, because what happens is that the colony starts to break up, and suddenly many penguins are on the edge, and so the predators swoop in, and so you have these catastrophic collapses of the population that arise purely because of their interaction of their nearest neighbor preferences and the terrain. And so we think that some populations are actually more vulnerable because the topographical complexity of their habitat puts them in a vulnerable position. So they're just closer to the knife edge of that tipping point where they blink out quite quickly, perhaps before we could intervene and do something to protect them. So there are conservation implications for some of this work, which are important as well.
Which takes me in another direction of, part of the priesthood of physics is the purity of it all and the abstraction of it all. But by the time you've arrived at something like conservation biology, it's kind of like you've got a pretty specific axe to grind. That you're trying to conserve things. It's not destruction biology, which could be a thing, or chaotic biology, or whatever it is. How does that feel? That why are we so anti these predators? The predators have to eat too. They do, and we have to remind. I work mostly on commercial cruise ships, so we're down there with passengers. We do most of our survey work off cruise ships, and they always want to intervene when they see these skuas come in and attack the penguins, and we have to remind them that they are an important part of the ecosystem as well. So you're right. In fact, this dynamic between the penguins and the predators is entirely natural and has gone on for a long time and should go on for a long time in the future. What's less natural is both that we're harvesting the krill that the penguins are eating, and also that the climate is changing. And so
understanding their dynamics is getting us at those.
We're competing with the penguins for the krill.
We are. So if you go to the Costco or CVS and you see the krill oil supplements, that by and large comes from the Antarctic, and so you are competing with penguins for those krill, for better or worse.
Okay, well, there's some conservation biology I can get behind. I mean, don't buy the krill pill, or whatever.
The fish may be smelly, but at least you're not competing with penguins. So.
Wow. So, well, I mean that's just all great stuff. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that makes penguins so interesting is they seem obviously identifiable, relatable as individuals, but you do get, I don't know, how big are colonies? Tens of thousands?
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands, which means there's going to be statistical mechanical processes that are going to have important considerations. So there's going to be spatio-temporal processes that are going to be just mechanically. There's no way that it couldn't be that. And so that's, the fact that you can end up putting an Ising model on top and actually get a bunch of juice out, it seems to me it's because of that simultaneously you have an individual penguin being all cute, and then you've got 100,000 of them.
Yep. And they are sort of a nice intermediate size, because we can build individual base models that are still computationally feasible, where we can track individuals over time. And at the same time, for the most part, the mean field time series work that we do works. So we can still treat them as sort of a continuous fluid when we have to. And 99% of our forecasting models assume them to be continuous. But we're kind of working from both ends, both taking advantage of how relatively few there are and sometimes taking advantage of how many there are, and trying to meet somewhere in the middle that we can understand their dynamics. So
earlier you mentioned contagion of behavior, which is a phrase that I haven't heard but sounded, well, I've heard, I guess, in human terms. I wasn't sure. Could you talk a little bit about that? What is that about?
Sure. So we've done a little bit of work on penguin behavior. In particular, looking at penguin acoustics. So if you look, one of the species that we study is called the Gentoo penguin. The Gentoo penguin, according to the textbooks and all that, have a relatively limited repertoire. They basically say, like, I love you and I hate you. Like, that's essentially it. They have two different kinds of calls, one involved in mating and one involved in aggression. But it turns out that they have a wider repertoire than that, and that's what we've been trying to uncover. And one of the things that they do that we don't understand is that they make this, in fact, this gets to the point process modeling we were talking about before. If you were to look at a time series of all the calls in the colony, you would expect them to perhaps be at random. It's like a Poisson process in time. It turns out that penguins, when one penguin makes a call, that there is a period of about 2 or 3 seconds where the colony is quieter than you would expect by random chance. So they're actually trying to avoid talking over one another, and if that one penguin is calling for its mate, they give that penguin time to wait for the response before they're all talking. And they're quite noisy in general, so it was surprising that we found this statistical, zone of, being polite. But they make a very similar call that actually triggers the entire colony to start calling all at once, a bit like dogs in the neighborhood. So, you hear a dog call or bark, and then all the dogs in the neighborhood are barking, and you're not sure why. Penguins do this too. So one penguin will make a call, and instantaneously the whole colony will all start calling. And we don't understand the difference between the I'm calling and everyone's going to be polite and be quiet, and I'm calling and everyone's going to join in.
It sounds the same, you're saying.
We have examined the acoustics for years, and we think it's got to be something they're doing with their body. Like their body posture is indicating one or the other. But I think that their social lives are much more complex than we give them credit for. Everything that 99% of what you'll see about penguin communication has to do with mating. But the fact of the matter is that most of the time, just like you or I, they're not with their mate. They're with the other people. They're with the other penguins in the colony. So they clearly have mechanisms for communicating socially in ways that have nothing to do with mating behavior. But we've also looked at aggression. So if you've ever seen a penguin colony, what you'll see is penguins use stones to build their nests.
Right.
99% of finding enough stones for your nest is thievery. You're going to steal stones from your neighbor's nest. Now, we've looked at gaming out, like game theory of stone stealing. So you would expect that there's more stealing on the edge because those penguins have not been neighbors for as long. By the time you get to the center of the colony, those are older penguins that have been neighbors with their neighbors for years and have probably reached some sort of détente where they're like, I'm not going to go after your nest. You don't go after mine. We're good. But if a penguin even approaches another penguin that's on the nest, it'll be wary because it'll be like, I don't know you. Are you here to steal from my nest? And so we looked at, for example, aggression. So how often does a penguin have to approach your nest before you escalate from a dirty look to a lunge to I'm actually going to get off my nest and chase you away, which is kind of the ultimate. And does your annoyance depend on how many other penguins have passed by? Like if that's the fourth penguin to pass by, it's nothing that penguin did. You were just annoyed. Like that penguin was just mad and it was going to go after you. So there are these. So we've been looking at penguin aggression, and we never really got a chance to publish the paper I wanted to entitle "Angry Birds," but they are angry birds, and those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. So they're much more nuanced creatures than we maybe give them credit for.
So I mean, I would guess that there's human utterances like "Hey," that you could look at the spectral signature all day long, and you'll never figure out whether that's a alert for danger or a alert for happiness unless you know the state of the colony that is hearing the thing, which would make one much more likely than the other. So therefore, everybody just assumes like that. I would wonder, does the one where everybody shuts up for a minute, does the pause grow with the colony size?
So we've looked at colony size as a factor. In particular, I should say the genesis of all this research was trying to understand whether penguins have different dialects. So whether penguins that are at different colonies actually talk differently. Do they sound different? And they do. It turns out that there's a certain amount of what we think is just cultural drift, that they start calling differently in different areas. Our interest in that was whether when you're founding a new colony, which doesn't happen very often, are you more likely to mate with someone that's from your own colony, or are you in some way dissuaded by a penguin that sounds different?
Or looking for an exotic accent.
Exactly. So maybe you're into that kind of thing. Maybe you're turned off by it. I don't know. So that's how we kind of got into this initially. But we did pair all of this audio with video as well. So we were trying to figure out, what does the call sound like for skua? What does the call sound like for giant petrel, or human for that matter? But
so you said skua is a sea lion enemy. Or something?
It's actually a bird. It's a big bird with a hooked bill. And they go after humans as well. And so I would come back with these tales of being attacked by skuas, or at least a bluff attack. Sure. And my husband would be like, yeah. And then we went to the American Museum of Natural History, and they have this beautiful display of Southern Ocean birds. And he saw a skua in the display, and he says, "Oh," it's like, "Yeah, I see."
Because they're big and they're scary looking.
They're giant, and they come at you with their talons out first. But what makes them so deadly to the penguin, and the reason why the colony shape is so important, is that they work in teams. So the male and the female will work together, and one will distract a penguin while the other steals the eggs. And that coordination is much more effective at the edge of the colony than in the interior. So it's not like they can just swoop in and grab it. They have to be a bit sly, and their ability to work as a team, I think, is pretty cool to watch.
Okay, so and they're not necessarily going after the penguins themselves, except in rare cases.
They do go after the chicks, but they certainly wouldn't go after an adult. So they will fly off with a little chick, which is the part of Antarctica which very much is cut out of the Disney film when the chick goes off.
Well, So is Antarctica fucked? Are we fucked? I mean, is this all moot at this point because the whole thing is being churned by climate change? And what's your take?
Yeah, well, Antarctica is in a much better position than the Arctic. So I will say things look really bad in the Arctic. The Arctic is, an ocean surrounded by land, as you know.
Right.
Antarctica, at least, is a continent.
Right.
The change in albedo, when in the reflectance, is not as severe when you lose the snow off of rock than when you lose the snow off the ocean, because you lose the snow off the ocean and suddenly you're just absorbing all of that solar energy right into the ocean, whereas the dynamics are
a little more of an insulator or something.
Yeah, and the Antarctic, the ice sheet is so thick that we've got some time. But there are big concerns. Maybe not, like things are going to go extinct quickly, but certainly in the sense of things rearranging themselves. Animals are going to start going extinct over certain areas. They're going to start appearing in other areas. We have some animals that are moving into the Antarctic from the subantarctic, so some new arrivals in the Antarctic that will eventually rearrange the food web. So things are changing, but it's not, I don't think, as dire as we've seen in the Arctic, just because of its geography. But geopolitically, the Antarctic is in some ways a more difficult situation because no one owns the Antarctic. And so to the extent that we're going to save it, it's going to require quite a bit more cooperation than we typically see.
Yeah, I was reading something about the Arctic, how it was all sort of divided up, and they were actually kind of taking care of the things not so terribly amongst the 7 members of the Arctic Circle Club, or whatever it's called. And so there's no analog to that for Antarctica.
So Antarctica is governed by the Antarctic Treaty, which is considered one of the most successful international treaties. But at the same time, any real decision-making in the Antarctic requires full consensus among all the signatories to the treaty, which includes Russia and the United States and New Zealand and China and a lot of countries that don't agree on much. And so it's hard for them to really agree down the line on much of anything. So I think that's the real challenge to protecting the Antarctic.
And then again, if the penguins are the indicator species for the Antarctic, then the Antarctic is the indicator continent for the planet. Then these things just keep rippling out and rippling out.
Absolutely, and in some ways, the Antarctic is in better shape than many of the other continents, and I think penguins will be doing okay long past, other species, like the northern white rhino. And, we have a lot of species in a lot of trouble. And in some ways, I'm grateful to work in an ecosystem that is as intact as the Antarctic. But there are lessons to be had here in terms of which species are going to survive. And the ones that are doing well are the ones that are very flexible. They're very adaptable. They're the generalists of the Antarctic. And I've always thought there's quite a lesson there for ourselves in terms of what's a successful strategy for us as humans to deal with climate change. I think looking at species that have been successful under climate change is one way to go about it.
So what would you say is the thing that we should be concentrating on the most to help turn things around? Is it we should all become biologists? We should all concentrate more on computation? Is it we should become better storytellers? Is it we just have to learn how to get along better? Like, from what you've seen, where can we get the most leverage?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a real believer in engineering our way out of this problem. I have trouble thinking that we're all just going to become better, more selfless people. And I'm not sure that knowing what's going on is going to save the world. I mean, we know that masks work, and that hasn't helped. So I'm not sure that more information is necessarily going to lead to behavior changes. But I think that in terms of more efficient sources of energy, battery technology, carbon capture and storage, I think there are technological solutions, and computing has to be a big part of that. Like it or not, I think computing is going to be one of the big sources of greenhouse gas emissions over the next century. Computing is very costly, and we don't think about that. What it costs just to do a simple search on Google or to buy something on Amazon. We focus on the truck that drives down our road to deliver it, but not on the servers that made that transaction possible. And so I don't know. I'd be curious what you guys think in terms of the future of making those costs of computing more transparent to consumers, because it's one area where it's hard for them to make an informed decision about what does it cost to doom scroll through Twitter all day? I don't know. It's not nothing.
And how much of it is psychological versus carbon generation?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess I certainly don't know enough to know what the amortized cost of a Amazon order is in terms of just keeping the servers hot enough to do it like that. I mean, I know these nightmare tales about Bitcoin mining and so forth, where the whole point is to waste energy. It's like, well, maybe we could do a little better than that. I mean, certainly, the computational stuff that I'm working on is about going indefinitely parallel and giving up on the centralized CPU model, which is what drives the need to make the clock go as fast as possible, which is what drives the need to switch the switches as fast as possible, which is what drives the nonlinear heat costs. So I have hope that when we can turn the clock way, way, way back down, because it'll be kind of just happening everywhere, that we can see a net win net reduction in energy consumption. And it shouldn't, we got the brain at 20 watts or whatever the hell it is, like that. So there's something to head for. It's an awful long road to get there. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm a little dubious about the engineering our way out. I mean, it seems like that's the American way, and that's I feel like I'm sort of a recovering engineeraholic. Well, I mean that there are these risks that it's a whole nother direction. Here I go about the risk that scientific results can be sort of cherry-picked by, say, corporate interests, used to justify policy changes that they wanted, just because it happens to go, some particular result happens to go in their direction, even if there isn't really any larger causal or structure to make it sensible. And that is a concern that I have, and it's a concern that I have specifically about sometimes ecological studies and environmental studies, like, palm trees are good, so that means we can destroy the rainforest to make palm tree plantations, that kind of thing. And, how to avoid that, I think, if anything, it goes to what Michael was saying about narrative, that if we can make the narrative really, really clear, then maybe it's harder to get away with that kind of thing.
I hope you're right. I do. Yeah. I do. I struggle with this a lot, and I do worry. Sitting in biology, I worry that I'm nothing more than a sideline reporter to the game. I can tell people what's going to happen to the Antarctic, under climate change, and I can report on how quickly the Titanic is sinking. But I don't feel in that sense like I'm making it sink less quickly. Right. And I do think that there are, and that's hard for me because I came more from the physics side, where I felt like I was working in more on the quantum computing side and that kind of thing. That there's some very smart people trying their very best to solve these problems. So I'm torn. I mean, it's important enough that I get up every day and try and tell people what's happening in the Antarctic. But if we're not actually going to do anything about it, then it feels like we've just documented the end. And it will be very well documented, but I don't know.
Presiding over
I'm
the
torn.
decline.
It does feel like it documenting the decline, but unless someone picks up the mantle and decides not to go to the Antarctic, if I'm being honest, just the climate, the carbon emissions of that trip alone.
Well, and as you were saying, that a lot of the scientific data gathering you do are piggybacked on commercial.
About 90% of it.
Like that. So, I mean, there's the risk of science washing a trip that it would better not to have happened. Or there could be, but nonetheless, this really is useful data. And the question is, can we make that data work enough so that it's a net win?
Absolutely. So I tell the passengers, when we're down there, we're giving lectures, we're science communicators the whole time. Right. And I tell them that all of us come back in debt to Mother Earth. Every single one of us has made made the Earth a little bit worse off for having come down to the Antarctic, and I spend the rest of the year trying to pay that debt back, and they should too. I think we owe it to make the best use of the information we have, and what that means for us is really focused on open source data and software, putting the data out there, making it easy for people to find. I work very closely with the Antarctic Treaty Parties and the fisheries management groups to shovel data their way so that they're making policy based on the best available information. It's just one example. We found through satellite imagery this huge population of Adelie penguins in a chain of islands called the Danger Islands. So, as a direct result of that discovery, they've expanded the proposed marine protected area to include the Danger Islands. So that's as direct a connection between the kind of science we're doing and policy as I may ever have in my whole career. And it does feel like I'm chipping away at the debt of a career's worth of going down to the Antarctic.
Well, and a couple of chunky additions to the conservation zone can pay off a lot of debt.
I certainly, and to make sure that we're putting those protected areas in the right places. It would be easy to conserve 30% of the ocean if we just stuck those conserved areas anywhere. Yeah, right. It's about picking the areas that actually are hotspots for biodiversity that we want to protect.
Wow.
So I think another way that you've been paying back the debt is you come back and you tell everybody your stories. And I want to thank you for sharing your stories with us today. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that was really great. Now I'm all, what can I do? So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
This was Computing Up. Thanks for listening.